the sickness of Gilgamesh and his dissatisfaction that he's going to die, and the reassurances of the great things he's achieved, including bringing back knowledge from before the flood, which I'll get back to later. And then, again, the texts are broken, but what they describe is something very like what we see archaeologically from the royal tombs of Ur, of which this is a reconstruction. A mass burial. The ruler is placed there with servants, with soldiers, with wealth. The ruler is going to have a palace in the underworld. Now, in the standard Babylonian epic, because they want to keep Gilgamesh alive, they transform part of this into the burial of Enkidu. It doesn't necessarily mean that in 750 BCE they knew about the royal tombs of Ur, but there are textual similarities, there's a textual lineage there. So Gilgamesh buries Enkidu. Later he admits that he is frozen into stasis by Enkidu's death. He admits that he sat by the rotting body, not knowing what to do, until a maggot falls out of the body's nose. Okay? He's in denial for a long time about Enkidu's death. So, following Enkidu's burial, Gilgamesh decides that he has to find the flood survivor, and he sets off on his quest. He doesn't know exactly where to go, but he arrives at the twin peaks of Mount Marshu, which are the entrance to a tunnel under the mountains which is associated with the passage of the sun. And he meets there the first of several people in his travels who live outside of any fixed dimension in a way. They're interstitial characters. And these characters are the scorpion men, a scorpion man and his spouse, perhaps. And this image of a scorpion man is taken from, again, one of our objects. Some of you will have seen it. It's from the bull-headed lyre. The faceplate of the lyre has a banqueting scene with some animals carrying trays, and at the bottom is this scorpion man. And the scorpion men challenge Gilgamesh and ask him what he's about, and they understand that he's two-thirds God, and eventually they let him pass. And Gilgamesh passes into the tunnel under Mount Marshu, which is pitch black. One day he travels. It's pitch black. He can't see before him and he can't see ahead of him. 2 days he travels, 3 days, and so on. Until eventually he comes out into the light, into the garden of Shamash, where carnelian bushes and lapis lazuli bushes are in bloom. So it's a very alien landscape that he emerges into. He's traveling a long way away through several different environments. He's come under the mountains, now he's in the land beyond the mountains, and he makes his way to a bar, which I have to say, if I were traveling beyond the mountains, would be my temptation as well. The alewife there, Siduri, sees him coming, is not sure what kind of man he is, what kind of wild man he is. His clothes are disheveled. He's in a complete state. He reaches there, refreshes, cleans up a little bit, and she tells him how to find the boatman, or Shanabi. So he's making his progress to the mountains, past the scorpion men, under the mountains, beyond to this mysterious inn, the first and last inn. Yes? And he reaches the boatman, or Shanabi, who is at the sea, at the edge of the world, that you have to cross in order to get to the flood survivor. And there's something that's still very poorly understood about the narrative at this point, some characters called the Stone Ones that are somehow associated with Ur-Shanabi's passage across this deadly sea, and Gilgamesh kills the Stone Ones. So he does away with his means of getting across the sea that he wants to cross to visit Utnapishtim. Fortunately, there's an alternative. He can cut wooden punting poles. And here is an image of somebody punting in the marshes in Iraq. I can tell you it took me many, many years to realize that when I discussed this episode with my undergraduates, very often they didn't know what punting was. I resisted the temptation to put in one of my pictures from my Cambridge days here, choosing something more culturally appropriate. But it's the same idea. He has to cut enough punting poles to get across the sea without touching it. Pole, leave it, pole, leave it, pole, leave it. If you've ever punted, you know when you bring the pole up, you get wet. So he reaches Utnapishtim, which means finder of life. And there are several names for the flood survivor. Ziusudra is another one. Life of a remote day is how I would translate that. And the flood survivor tells him this very well-known story about how he came to be where he is and how he came to be immortal. And I think most of you probably know the outline of this story. The gods decide that humanity has to be wiped out, so they decree that there will be a flood, but the god Ea, who in Sumerian is called Enki, doesn't want humanity to be wiped out completely, and he saves one of the people who are most expert in his ways, Utnapishtim, or sometimes called Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. And this is a kind of wisdom that's associated with serving the gods, knowing how to serve the gods. Okay? So the flood survivor is the one who knows most about the special knowledge that pertains to Ea, the god of magic and knowledge. He's saved for a reason. And the gods let loose the flood. It rains for 6 days and 7 nights. And the boat they've built, the ark, it's very similar to the biblical stories, I'm sure most of you already know, is held fast on a mountain. And after 7 days, they start sending out birds, and the first 2 birds return, there's nowhere to land, and eventually the raven is sent out, and it flies around and doesn't come back to the boat because there's somewhere to land and there's food. And the first thing that Utnapishtim does is make a sacrifice to the gods. And the gods smell the savor of the sacrifice, and they gather round, buzzing like flies, because they've destroyed humanity, and humanity is what feeds them. Dough. Huh? So Utnapishtim knows exactly what to do when the flood is over. And after he tells Gilgamesh this tale, which is partly an explanation of the extremes that you need to go to become immortal, Gilgamesh says, but I really want to be immortal. And Utnapishtim says, well, all right then, if you want to be immortal, prove that you're good enough. Prove that you can stay awake for 7 nights. And as soon as he's issued the challenge, Gilgamesh starts to nod off. He's been traveling for a long time, and he was at that bar, right? So Utnapishtim says to his wife, bake bread. Every day, place a loaf of bread by his head, by Gilgamesh's head, and then when he wakes up, he'll see how long he's been asleep. So they do that, day after day, 7 days. And when Gilgamesh opens his eyes, he says what we've all said at some point. He says, oh, I wasn't sleeping, just resting my eyes, right? And Utnapishtim says, no, look at the bread. The bread tells its own story. So they concretize time. It's quite interesting. And the 7-day-old loaf is all moldy, and the 6-day-old one is shriveled, and so on. They're all in different states of decay. They're not edible, interestingly. Think about that for a moment in what I was saying about eating and changing dimensions. Maybe Gilgamesh had a chance to enter Utnapishtim's immortal dimension if he'd been able to eat the bread instead of falling asleep and leaving it there. In any case, Gilgamesh fails. Gilgamesh is too weak. And Utnapishtim says, well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go, and I'm not sure that you're going to make it home okay on your own, so I'm going to send Urshanabi with you. And Utnapishtim's wife intercedes and says, don't send him away empty-handed, give him one more chance. So Utnapishtim gives Gilgamesh a precious piece of knowledge. And the knowledge is the location of a plant under the sea, if you take the plant, if you eat the plant, you become young again. So sure enough, Gilgamesh goes with Ushabti and he dives down under the sea and he retrieves the plant that makes old men young again. And something in him makes him think, I'm going to try this on somebody in Uruk first. And he doesn't eat it. He doesn't trust Utnapishtim enough. He doesn't trust himself enough. He doesn't know enough about the plant lore to be sure that what he has is what he should be taking. He puts it down, and during the trip, a snake comes along and eats the plant and sloughs its skin as it slithers away. The snake becomes young again. That's why snakes shed their skin. Little etiological note, right? Because they managed to eat Gilgamesh's youth plant. Very nice little detail. So Utnapishtim sends Gilgamesh and Ushabti on their way, and they arrive back at Uruk, safe and sound. And this is the end of tablet 11 of the standard Babylonian version. I'll read it out just for the sake of it. Gilgamesh spoke to him, to Ushabti, "Go up, Ushabti, onto the wall of Uruk and walk around, survey the foundation platform, inspect the brickwork. See if its brickwork is not kiln-fired brick, and if the 7 sages did not lay its foundations. 1 square mile is city, 1 square mile is date grove, 1 square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk, its measurement." That's the end, if you believe that tablet 11 is the end of the epic, which there are good reasons for believing was the case at certain times in its development. Isn't that a bit anticlimactic? You go all this way and get back home and you're admiring the brickwork? Well, there's a trick to this ending, which is that it's circular. This is part of a frame. And it's a frame which brings you back to Uruk and back to the beginning of the composition. And I've jumped into the middle part of the preamble. I will explain, without getting into too much detail, that we know, partly because of Gilgamesh Tablet P, that the first line of Gilgamesh, around 1600 BC, was surpassing all other kings. That's line 29 in the Standard Babylonian epic. So we know that the first 28 lines of the Standard Babylonian epic are a later addition, and they're there to make a point. And this is the end of that later addition. And if you look at the part that overlaps, go up onto the wall of Uruk, you'll see that it overlaps up until measurement. And that's where the worm, the tail comes around and gets put back in the mouth of the worm, right? Like the Ouroboros. Because that's where you come back to open the tablet box of cedar, release its clasp of bronze, lift the lid of its secret, pick up the tablet of lapis lazuli, and read out all the misfortunes of Gilgamesh, all that he went through. That should say tablet. Gilgamesh tells you, with this circular frame, that it's partly about writing. It tells you that Gilgamesh doesn't achieve immortality. He can't eat the bread because he can't stay awake. He doesn't eat the plant because he doesn't trust himself. He doesn't act in a timely manner. But his deeds are written down, and it's the written version of them that you can read that notionally is in the walls of Uruk. So this is like all those books that start with the discovery of a manuscript in an attic. It's that kind of frame, right?